Hey there, and welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. In the past two lessons, we've talked about two different event models. We talked about the standards event model and the legacy Internet Explorer event model. Well, today we are going to combine those into one object that we can use to write cross-browser event code. So this is something that is fairly typical, although with the invention of jQuery or other JavaScript frameworks, it's all done for you. But since we are learning JavaScript, we are going to learn how to write cross-browser JavaScript. So let's go ahead and get started. We will start off very simple by writing some functions, and then we will refactor our code into a utility object that we can use. So let's first create a function that we can set event handlers with regardless of what browser the user is using. So let's call this function addEvent, and whenever you write cross-browser JavaScript, you have to be kind of broad because you have different pieces of information that you need in order to do what you need to do. Well, in the case of setting event handlers, we basically have the same information, it's just organized in a little bit different way. So the first thing we need is the HTML element object, or the DOM object that we want to set an event handler for. So we need to pass that as an argument to our addEvent function, and I'm going to call that argument L. The second thing we need is the event type that we want to listen to. I'm going to call that type. And then the third thing is the function that we want to execute whenever that event occurs. So I'm going to call that fn. And then we need to determine what browser the user is using. And we will do so by using feature detection. And we've used feature detection before, but as a refresher, we basically test to see if the browser supports a certain feature. And if it does, then we use that feature. And in the case of event code, we want to test for standards compliance first, because we always want to test for standards compliance because that's the standard. And the reason why we want to do that is primarily because of Internet Explorer, because it has a track history of how do I put this lightly, falling behind the rest of the pack as far as standards compliance is concerned. Like, for example, Internet Explorer 9 supports the standards event model, and it also supports the legacy Internet Explorer event model. Well, in the case of IE9, we want to use the standards-based event model because, that's the standard code. And if we test for standards-based code first, then in IE9, we can be guaranteed to use standards-based code. So let's use an if statement, and we just need to make sure that the addEvent listener is available to us to use. So we will use the type of operator, and then we will specify addEvent listener. We can also specify window or document, but we'll just stick with addEvent listener. And then let's make sure that this is not undefined, because if it's not undefined, then we can be relatively safe to assume that we can use the addEvent listener identifier as a method. So then we just need to call this method on the DOM object that we've passed to our addEvent method. So we will do l.addEvent listener. And then we need to pass in the event type that we want to listen for, the function that we want to execute, and then we need to specify whether if we want to capture or bubble. Well, if you remember in lesson 17, I told you that legacy Internet Explorer does not support capturing. It only supports bubbling. So since we are writing cross-browser event code, we want to use bubbling. So we are going to specify false here. And then that's it. So whenever there's a standards-based browser, whenever we call addEvent and we pass in the DOM object, the event type, and the function to execute, it's going to call addEvent listener. So now let's check for legacy Internet Explorer. So we'll do type of attach event. If it is not undefined, then we will do something similar to what we did with addEvent listener. We would do l.attachEvent, But now we have a slight little issue because the type value that we pass to add event listener is different than the type value that we pass to attach event. Attach event has to have on and then the name of the event. Well, that's not really that big of an issue because we can just pass the event type to our add event function, and then for attach event we will just prefix that with on. So we will do on plus type and then pass the function. So in the case of Internet Explorer 9, whenever this code executes, it's going to first test if the browser supports add event listener. It does, so it's going to execute line 3. And since this condition was met, it's not even going to try to evaluate this next condition because we've already met the if condition. So that way, Internet Explorer Internet Explorer 9 rather uses the standards-based code as opposed to the legacy Internet Explorer code. So if for some reason this is a browser that does not support either event model, we can be somewhat safe to assume that it supports DOM level 0 event handlers. But we have to do so in a little bit of a different way because we can't do L and then a dot and then a string on plus type. That's going to give us an error. So we have to use a different syntax, one that we haven't discussed yet, but since we are doing it now, we will discuss it. And that is using the square brackets. And then inside of the square brackets, we concatenate on with the event type. And then we set that to whatever function that we have passed. And the reason why this works is because we can actually access properties in two different ways. We have seen using the dot operator, so object dot property, but we can also use square bracket notation in that we pass a string value inside of the square brackets. So we can access that same property by using square brackets and then the string of that property name. So that's why we are doing it with this syntax here, so that we can concatenate on with type, and then we use the square brackets to access that particular property and assign the function object to it. And that finishes up our add event function. So let's test this to make sure that it works. Let's open up our script.js file. And this is the script that we ended with within the last lesson. So you can see that we are using attach event and detach event. So let's call our add event function. Let's pass in buttons I, and then the event type click, and then the function to execute button click. Let's get rid of lines 16 and 17 because we do not want to call attach and detach event. And then let's get rid of the code within our button click function. Let's just do alert and say this works. Let's also format this so that that is nice and pretty. And off screen, I went ahead and added the event utility.js to this HTML page. So whenever we run it within the browser, we will soon see if this will work or not. So let's launch it. And we should get an alert box that pops up, and then we should go to google.com. So clicking changed, there we go, this works. Let's click normal, great. Now let's run it in Internet Explorer. And if you are on Windows and if you have Internet Explorer 9, in order to switch it to a lesser version, i.e. 8 or below, you want to bring up the development tools, and you can do so by pressing the F12 key. And then you will want to choose either Internet Explorer 8 or Internet Explorer 7. It really doesn't matter because they both have the same exact event model. So I'm just going to choose Internet Explorer 7. Why not? And we need to copy in the URL and go to it. Whenever we click on changed, it switched to IE9, and you do need to make sure of that because it switches based upon the doc type. If it sees that it's a standard doc type, then it will automatically switch to the latest browser mode. So you will need to make sure that it is in something other than 9. And whenever you click on changed, we should see an alert box and we should go to Google. Fantastic. If we go back, Need to switch it back to IE7. That's a little annoying, but what are you going to do? Click normal, and we get the same thing. So our add event function is working excellently. We just need to create a remove event function. So let's just copy and paste that in, and then we will just change the function name to remove event, and then we will change add event listener to remove event listener. We'll do that again, remove event listener. We will change attach event to detach event. Detach. And then for the DOM level 0 event handler, we can just set this to null. And then that is going to get rid of the event handler that we set through add event. So let's go back to our script and let's remove this event handler. So let's do remove event. And we should not see an alert box pop up at all. So let's refresh. Click change. That worked fine. Let's go to normal. That worked fine. Let's go to Internet Explorer. Make sure that we are not in IE9 mode. Click changed. Excellent. And then let's go ahead and click normal. It's going to work, but you know, just for completeness, we will check it. Okay, so we can add and remove event handlers. Now we need to write code to get the event target because they are two separate properties. And we also need some way of preventing the default action from occurring. So let's first write a function called getTarget, and it's going to get our target of the event. So let's do var getTarget equals function. We get the target information from the event object, so let's call that event. And then let's write the code to handle standards-based code. Now the target property is what we use to get the target information. So let's do type of event.target does not equal undefined. Then we want to return event.target. Otherwise, we have Internet Explorer. So we want to return event.sourceElement. And then that finishes that function. The next function we need to write is to prevent the default action from occurring. So let's just call this prevent default. And once again, that ability is given to us via the event object. So once again, feature detection. So type of event.prevent default does not equal undefined. Then we want to call event.preventDefault. Otherwise, we have Internet Explorer, so let's do event.return value equals false. So now we have all of the abilities that we need. We can add event handlers, we can remove event handlers, we can get the target of the event, we can also prevent the default action from occurring. So let's go back to our script and let's rewrite our button click function to use our cross-browser functions now. So the first thing we need to do is get the target, because if you remember, Internet Explorer doesn't give us this variable referring to the element that we've set it as. It is set as window. So we have to get the target. So let's call getTarget. We'll pass EVT, because remember, both event models pass the event object as the parameter. Internet Explorer just gives us another way to get that information if we want to use the global event object. And then we need to get the class name. So let's do class name equals target.innerHTML to lowercase. Next, we need to prevent the default action from occurring. So let's call prevent default. We'll pass the event object, and then we want to set the class name property on the body to whatever class name we have within our variable. So let's go back to the browser and let's run this and see if we get the results that we are anticipating. So let's click changed, and something didn't work there. So we need to figure out what didn't work. And let's check the error console first. So we're not seeing anything there. So syntactically our code is okay. So something is going wrong with the code that we wrote, or at least that I wrote. And we know add remove works, but we are still calling remove event. Well, that would be an issue. So let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh, and we should get our results. There we go. Let's view it in Internet Explorer using IE7 mode. And that works, but that's IE7 for you. Let's switch this to IE8. There we go. That's a little bit more correct. And so our code is working now in every browser that we support because we have written cross-browser functions. But these functions are global. And if you remember, whenever we talked about the window object in lesson 11, we want to limit the impact our code has on the global scope. So it's really not feasible to completely avoid the global scope, especially in this particular case, because this is functionality that we want to use throughout our entire page. But we can limit the impact, so instead of having 4 global functions, we could have 1 global object, and that object could then have methods of add event, remove event, get target, and prevent default. So let's do that because that's a better option. And there are a few different ways that we can do this, but probably the most correct would be to just create the event utility object using object literal notation, and then specifying these methods using object literal notation. And the reason why I say that this would be the most quote-unquote correct would be because it would have the better performance. Because the other methods involve immediately invoked functions and then creating the function objects and then creating an object and then assigning functions, and just more really work that the JavaScript engine has to do as opposed to just creating one single object. So as I finish writing or changing this to use object literal notation, let's tab these things over to make the white space a little bit prettier. And now we just have one object called event utility, and it has 4 methods that we can use within our code. So let's go back and make these changes. All we have to do is add in event utility dot anytime that we've used one of these utility functions. So prevent default, and then event utility add event. So let's test this out within the browsers. Let's refresh. We get that in Chrome. Let's check Legacy IE. We are in IE8 mode, and we get the same results. So this is just one approach that you can take to write cross-browser JavaScript, especially dealing with events. I say that this is just one of the approaches because you can take a variety of approaches to write cross-browser JavaScript. You could write code for legacy Internet Explorer to emulate, or at least closely emulate, the standard event model. You could do that if you wanted to, but that requires a lot more code, and that requires some complex code as well. This approach was very easy. All we had to do was create some helper functions and make them methods of an object that we can use. So instead of writing all of those if statements inside of our event handlers, or whenever we need to set up an event handler, we can just create that utility and call those helper methods as we need to. But we're not done with events yet. In the next lesson, we are going to talk about event delegation, which allows us to be a little bit more flexible, and it also helps with performance as well. So I will see you next time. Have a good one.